Thank you for joining the Resilient Cyber Show. My name is Chris Hughes, and today we're joined by Richard Bird. Richard, thanks for being here.
Good to be here. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, definitely, man. I'm excited to chat with you. So for folks that don't know you, haven't come across you at all in some capacity, do you mind telling us a bit about your background?
Yeah, I spent 20 plus years in the corporate side, like we were just talking about. All of those were in Columbus, Ohio. Go Bucks! And after I decided to get out of the corporate fold, changed everything. Sold everything that I had, moved to Colorado. Live out here in Denver, and I've been solution side focused now for almost 5 years. And first started out in advising. A lot of focus on cybersecurity. I've both been a CIO and a CISO in my background, and then I just decided that I wasn't ever going to go back to corporate. So went to work for Ping Identity in a market-facing role called Chief Customer Information Officer, which is a title that you make up when you hang out with the CEO and you can't figure out what to call the title. I did that for about 3 years. I did a brief stint as a chief product officer to get back operational. And then just a couple weeks ago, I became the chief security officer for Traceable, a API security play that was founded by the founders that created App Dynamics, which was a few years ago, and a very, very successful company. So it's been a great journey coming over to the solution side. I don't see ever switching back to corporate roles. It's way too much fun trying to solve cybersecurity issues for lots of people instead of trying to solve cybersecurity issues for one company. And I get a lot of fulfillment and enjoyment out of it. So having a blast.
Yeah, it's awesome. You have a really unique background. I can attest on the consultant side. That's kind of the role I play right now. I like working with a lot of different organizations, a lot of different unique challenges, a lot of different political, infighting and stuff, depending on organizations too. So I wanted to ask, you mentioned this, you've held CIO and CISO roles. That just actually made me think of something. There's a lot of debate, about who the CISO should report to and, all those good things, right? What's your thoughts on that topic, given you've held both roles?
Well, anybody that spends any time putting up with listening to anything that I have to say will know that I have very, very strong opinions that I do like to believe fall into two categories. First of all, they're always open for debate unless they're backed and supported by evidence and data. And in those cases, it becomes a discussion about, is your data, evidence, and information better than mine relative to our positions? So when we think about this, who should the CISO report to question, it's been a debate for the ages for the last 15 or 20 years. And I can tell you, having been an IT and information security practitioner, and now being one again, part of my job as CSO is our company's security posture and risk management. The problem with a CISO reporting into purely IT functions is that IT budgets are then controlled by need and demand in the moment. So what you end up with is something similar to kind of Tyler Durden and Fight Club, where a CISO comes with a list of unmitigated risks, comes with a list of issues and challenges that need to be addressed in terms of security posture and risk. And then you have to get into, squaring up and fighting for your piece of the budgetary pie. The problem with that mechanic, and that's typically what you see with a CISO that reports to a CIO or CTO or somebody within the IT executive management chain, the problem with that dynamic is that if I don't get funded for this particular piece of cybersecurity solution or this particular set of talents and resources from a headcount standpoint, the risk doesn't go away. Right. And this dynamic has really stymied the ability for CISOs to take risks relative to innovation, take risks relative to new approaches and methodologies. I'll give you a great example. Right. I've been around long enough that, the OSI 7-layer networking model was the way that security was developed. Then along comes, kind of early-ish 2000s defense in depth. Everybody, says I'm going to defense in depth, right? And then now everybody's like, I'm going to zero trust, right? These are the executive statements that are being made at the top of the house in the executive suite. And here's the truth. You get popped on a VPN, you're on an OSI 7-layer model, right? You are not functioning in either DID or in zero trust, but you've been telling everybody that you have been. And what causes those kinds of messages to happen? Well, what causes those messages to happen is this is my desire as a CISO to move to these better cybersecurity strategies and architectures, but I'm getting no funding to do it. So it's where we want to go aspirationally, but it's not where we're able to go budgetarily because that CISO is really, really hamstrung in the way of reporting structures. Just to put a point on where the CISO really should report to, it should be direct association to the risk committee of the board with a direct reporting relationship to the CEO or the COO. Because ultimately, no matter what anybody talks about relative to, risk, this idea that reputational risk it drives companies, it's garbage. Reputational risk doesn't change a damn thing in the cybersecurity space in terms of behaviors, acquisition of solutions, because studies really show that 90 days after a breach, the stock is recovered. There's no damage in terms of lost revenues. And so the chief operation officer alignment puts you directly in the pathway of mitigating risks, operational risks that are associated with operations and with revenue. And that's really what company care about. Don't get me shut down and don't make me lose opportunities to acquire revenue. And that alignment would have a huge impact, a positive impact on the cybersecurity profession in terms of the delivery of our results.
Yeah, you said a lot of great things there. I like where you're going with like the board reporting and the line of reporting to COO, CEO, those kind of things. Actually, and then also the market aspect. I shared an article from Kelly Shortridge not too long ago. It said the market doesn't give a fuck about cybersecurity, and a lot of people got really heated about that because we like to believe it does, right? We want to we want to convince ourselves that it does, but studies, as you said, don't really bear that fruit out. So it's hard to accept that for some folks. One thing I want to ask you too, like real quick before we dive to the technical topics, you mentioned that you're a CSO right now, right? Versus CISO. For folks that don't know the distinction between a CISO or a CSO, what are the differences and why do organizations go with one or the other, or even both in some cases?
Yeah, when you look at the CSO role, what you're really finding is companies that are recognizing that the division of leadership over multiple facets of security isn't ideal. So in the corporate world, quite a few friends that are CSOs, and in that case, you're seeing a collapse of traditionally separated functions into one holistic security program. So, beyond the cybersecurity, and I'm old enough that, it's information security, but beyond cybersecurity, with corporate side CSOs, you see a folding in of physical security. And when you think about, the history of hacks and exploits, there are several hacks and exploits that have been successful through the physical plane, right? Whether that be, accessing compute assets that are remotely located or accessing networks that are, separate because they're plant, networks and those kind of things. And then also in the enterprise space, you see the folding in of fraud, which I think is really, really interesting because fraud, last I checked, nobody is conducting, and I'm an old banker. So last I checked, nobody is doing fraud, by hammering out brass plates that go on the old ka-chunk, three-part, tear-apart credit card slips anymore. And check kiting has gone 21st century and in digital form, and especially with things like the Zelle hack, as we're all kind of really painfully aware of. And so you see those folding in. Now on the solution side, I would opine that the CSO's role is still multifaceted, but I focus on both internal as well as product security, right? Which traditionally have been again two separated disciplines within the security within solutions companies, because you would see product security more aligned to your product engineering group and to your and to a product security specialist function. And then of course your security function internally is G&A, and is part of your daily everyday business. And a CSO role takes and combines those functions plus others in terms of my participation in the security community. So I think what you're seeing is just an elevation of the title because of a increase of the number of functions that are expected to be managed under that title. I wish, going back to your other question, I wish that meant the correct alignment relative to where a CSO should report to. And CISOs are definitely, managing a huge threat landscape. But I think most CISOs will say that, they're not managing fraud. They're not managing product security aspects. They're managing typically information security that is outward facing relative to usually workforce populations. You don't see a lot of CISOs that are very heavily involved in, say, the CIAM frontier for customer access management yet. But that's going to start to change too. So I do actually think that there's going to be a trend for CSO to be the dominant title within the information security trades in large enterprises. In small enterprises, it'll still be a director of information security.
Yeah, it's actually a really great way to put it. It makes a lot of sense when you explain it like that, the distinction of physical and fraud and product security. And I think that brings it all together and explains why we're seeing that elevation of the title. So I did want to ask you, you've been doing, identity-centric roles for quite a while, like, in different organizations. Obviously, you've been in the career field long enough to see the transition from on-prem to cloud or hybrid environments, things like that. What do you think some of the primary things that change when it comes to identity and security when you talk cloud adoption?
Well, the funny thing is look, I think it's important to kind of give background. I became this, guy in identity because, again, kind of reflecting my age when information security was first being centralized and organized, particularly in large banking environments. I'm the only one that wanted the job. Um, like like I remember sitting in a room and there was a question asked by somebody who's now been a multi-time CSO and CISO and is now a very, very good friend of mine. She said, look, nobody wants to take identity. Is there anybody dumb enough to do it? And I was like, yeah, I'll do it. And frankly, I just really didn't know much about what I was getting myself into. And I always kind of liken it to, there's three kinds of kids when it comes to learning how to swim. First kid jumps off the end of the dock, takes off like he's, A-Rod at the plate, when he was an 8-year-old, and you look at him and go, that guy's a natural, right? The second one, you throw them in and they splash around and they jump out and they go, man, I almost drowned, but I want to learn how to swim. And we love those, types of folks because they've got the stick to itiveness. And then there's the other, that you toss into the pool and or into the lake and they just sink like a stone. They're never going to swim. Right. And no matter how hard you try. And I think I was on the natural swimmer side unexpectedly with identity when I got thrown into the lake. And it just kind of fit. It always has made sense to me. Now, when we bring it forward to cloud, my biggest beef, and I kind of yell about it quite a bit. My biggest beef is that the same mistakes that we were remediating 15 years ago in the identity plane, in the landed data center space, are the same mistakes that are now being repeated again in the cloud. And it makes sense because Bob, who broke into production 8 separate times, without using process, without using break glass, he's got a back door. Bob didn't go away, right? Bob went to go work for AWS, right? Or Bob went to go work for Google. And those same bad behaviors that were facilitated by that manager who said, you can't fire Bob because if Bob gets hit by a bus, we have to shut down this entire part of our IT organization because Bob's that important. And yes, I know he keeps breaking rules. You see these things manifesting. I'll give you a great example. Very big headline breach a couple of years ago in the cloud space. Turns out that the bad actor who recently was determined not to need to serve jail time. I'm not indicating who the hack was or where the hack occurred, but just last week got probation. That person leveraged a functional account to access an S3 bucket and make a copy of that S3 bucket. And the way that that breach went down was the encryption keys were associated to the functional role. Now, we blew that kind of garbage out of our systems and on premises a decade ago, right? You don't associate an encryption key with an actual functioning account. Why? Because if you get the account, you've got the encryption. Ergo, there is no encryption, right? But these kind of things keep happening in the cloud space all the time. And I think it's because there is a huge lack of understanding of identity's core functional role in security within the cloud. And I don't think that I'm throwing stones at folks that operate in the cloud world when I say that, because I operate in the cloud world. But what I'm saying is that we refuse to understand the patterns of history and the data of the past, and we are therefore doomed to repeat the same problems, right? And now we see that manifesting in the cloud. The problem is the scale and size of the cloud and compute and instances and the distribution now creates more catastrophic consequences when a bad identity-driven related breach or an exploit happens. And the last leaving off point that I'll make is that there's a certain amount of hubris as well, right? You know, who remembers, I wish I could see a show of hands, who remembers that the great dream and the great message about cloud was free compute for everybody? Well, that didn't work out, right? But that was what we were sold. And then when you kind of reel that forward, I remember people saying, oh, look, if we get, if the cloud gets breached, it's only going to impact your instance, not anybody else. Well, that's proven to be very untrue, right? Like there's this idea that technology is mystical and it's going to dodge the patterns and the bad things of the past. It may operate, those bad things may be executed on a different platform, different code base, different, all of that. But the patterns and characteristics are still the same because human beings are executing these hacks, and it still comes down to means, motive, intent. It's just still criminals doing criminal stuff, right? It's just that they're using different weapons to do it. And if we don't appreciate and understand that within the identity plane, we just do all the same stupid stuff, a decade after we were trying to fix it in the cloud. And that's exactly what's happening.
Yeah, I think you've pointed out, as you've been in the career field long enough, you start to notice trends of behavior and tactics, and maybe the certain nuance and specifics of it change, right, with the technology, but the fundamentals stay the same. You start to see those patterns over and over again. It just follows the technology.
Well, Chris, if I can just
go ahead.
If I can put a simple motto on that thing. Look, the entire world of exploits and breaches is simply boiled down to someone trying to be someone they're not to get something they shouldn't have. There is no simpler way. Matter of fact, that's the way I explain breaches and hacks to my 80-year-old father, right? Like, and yet we forget that and put this huge layer of mysticism over the top of technology. Why? Because we are protecting turf, we're protecting headcount, we're protecting budget. I get all of that, right? The problem is that we're being intellectually dishonest when we refuse to acknowledge that those are our own motives as it relates to, what we want to build, how we want our architectures to look, what tools that we want, right? I mean, it's just that simple. Somebody being someone they're not to get access to something they shouldn't have. And we really have done a fantastic job of overcomplicating that reality for the last 30 or 40 years.
Yeah, I think what you said there really jumped out to me is the mysticism and the intellectual dishonesty part, because, we've heard a lot lately of security is everyone's job. Well, if it is, we need to make it more accessible with language they can actually understand and not try to do this hand wavy, You could get some thoughts on that. Go ahead. Go ahead.
Well, sorry if I hurt anyone's feelings. Security is not everybody's job. There is nothing in history that supports that statement, right? Entire kingdoms were developed to protect resources, assets, and people, populations, police forces, volunteer, as well as paid fire departments. Like, the reality is that the behaviors and patterns that are associated with how we provide security to people have existed for millennia. And in the digital world, we've again just ignored all of those realities, right? The digital world is nothing but a representation of the analog world, right? Technologists hate it when I say it, but look, technology is a tractor, right? It is a means of production, right? It might be a means of personal production on social media channels and whatever, and it might be a means of production, building Mercedes in Stuttgart, right? But it's still a means of production, and when we give it this, gloss of being something more important, it leads us to making statements like people just need to get smarter about security. Well, here's the thing: human beings suck at personal risk management and personal security. I always like to use the example. Most people are completely unaware that if you go to the insurance industry and you say, okay, what causes most of the insurance claims that result in payouts for burglary losses? 80+% of burglary losses every year. Home break-ins, stealing your junk, doors unlocked. 80%. And that number hasn't changed for decades, right? Is there anybody listening to this? Is there anybody that that doesn't know that a locked house is more secure than an unlocked house? And yet 80% of the time when people are getting paid back for insurance, their doors were unlocked. And here's something that's really interesting. I'll almost guarantee you that a vast super majority of that 80% each year that gets popped, they start locking their damn doors after that, right? This is the characteristics, the reality of human behavior, psychology. So if your solution or your security strategy depends on people getting smarter about cybersecurity, you're doomed. It's just that simple, because you're putting faith and trust in a behavior and a mechanic that just simply does not exist in human beings. We care about security, and you can reflect on this on a personal level. We care about security as human beings when we're threatened. We absolutely do, right? When the grass is green and, stuff is growing well and, people are waving across the street, we leave doors unlocked, we give people keys, we don't think about security until the event horizon is directly in front of our faces.
Yeah, I think you said a lot of great things there, but I think when I take away from it is complacent or comfort breeds complacency, and complacency is going to breed risk, and that's just how it's going to go. And it's so funny, the parallels between the physical world, people get a break in, they go get their Simply Safe now, right? A little bit too late. You needed that before the incident, not after the incident, kind of situation. I did want to pivot a little bit and give some time to focus on your recent pivot career-wise to API security. What drew you to that space, and what are some things that people should be paying attention to on the API security front at the moment?
Well, what they should be paying attention to is everything, and I'm going to kind of actually take that back to that repeat of patterns. Look, people again are API economy has been around now for close to a dozen years. People are again ascribing mystical characteristics to APIs, right? They're not mystical, right? They're a repeat of another pattern, right? I lived through SSH key hijacking, probably close to a decade ago, which manifested in east-west lateral traffic, manifested in a 9 months dwell time, somebody in my, systems, right? And we didn't catch it. Why? Because once east-west traffic was starting to happen, our systems weren't looking for it because it was an expected behavior inside of our systems. So when we look at what's going on with, layer 7 application security, whatever you want to phrase it, we're seeing the next evolution of virtualization, right? So we're seeing the entire infrastructure layer being left out of the equation because all of the feature functionality capabilities can now be executed app to app, app to data store, app to signal, right? And yet another painful truism about technology: anytime something new is developed, and APIs would definitely be within that category, API, microservices, architectures, and everything. Every time that's developed, the developers are off to the races, and security is 5 to 8 years behind. This is not Richard's opinion. You could actually go sift through mountains of information and clearly see. I mean, we're talking who remembers when HTML popped up, right? And And how long was it before we got to securitization capabilities with HTML or CSS, or like when we first came into the world of the internet on a commercial basis, we were years behind from a security standpoint. API security is very much the same situation. Right now, there are people that are sitting on this call. You have millions of API calls that are bouncing around internally and externally, and you literally have no security governance, no security framework, no security guardrails around those APIs. And it's, while it's understandable, the fact is I'm talking to senior level folks, and they go, I don't have an API security problem. I got a WAF and a gateway. Well, history clearly shows that those approaches or those patterns do not yield security. So, for me, API security is the true next frontier. I actually think that within the course of the next couple of years, most security focus is going to be happening at application layers. But it is a space that has been horribly bad at security, not just in the cloud era, but horribly bad in security from its beginnings, because we have this tension between speed to market and time to value and all that kind of stuff. But then we try and bring the security folks into the DevOps equation. And again, it's like Fight Club, right? Like, don't get in my way. I'm trying to deliver, just figure out some, and this kind of goes back to, providing security without demanding that people become cybersecurity aware, right? This kind of comes down to, now you got to talk about runtime security, and API security is where runtime's going to be happening. So I'm super excited to make the transition. A lot of folks were like, dude, you've been an identity guy, which I'm always like, well, yes, but I was also a CISO. So I'm a multi-domain security professional. It just happens to be that I can talk, pretty about identity, right? But when I really, kind of dug into my desire to move to API security, look, the OAuth top 10 for API security, 30% of it is identity stuff, authorization, authentication, right? Object level, stuff that it's identity. And actually inventory and ownership are two of the biggest gaps in API security from a governance standpoint. Again, patterns we have all seen before, that we understand before. Now I'm just getting to do it with a new tool set, and man, it's super exciting. I love it. I mean, you can't say APIs don't move fast, because they move fast. So, it's kind of it's a speed, speed freak kind of experience for me, and I'm absolutely loving it.
Yeah, I couldn't help but laugh when you started naming some of the, common problems like inventory, right? This is something we've struggled with since it was physical, security of, devices and just tracking what endpoints we have and things like that. It's just a different paradigm, different technological, aspect to it. I wanted to ask, like, we've talked a little bit about cloud and on-prem and hybrid environments, things like that. What role do you think the proliferation of cloud and SaaS and microservices has played in like making API security a really critical concern now for most organizations?
Well, the beauty of APIs and the beauty of being able to execute at the application layer is that it allows you to free up stranded value that has been really bound up in the problems of, I hate to say legacy technology or legacy tech debt, right? So here's something for all the kids that are coming up in technology. If it's running and a company hasn't decided to refactor it to cloud, and it is fully paid for probably 20 years ago, and the only run rate that's associated with keeping that business critical application going is a handful of bodies, it's not legacy tech debt. It is a fully functioning, going to be here forever asset, and a company has made a business decision to keep it that way, right? They're literally not going, oh, poor us, it's old and it doesn't run correctly, right? That's the stuff that companies go fix, right? If it's old and it still runs and it still slays it, like, look, there's still I mean, we always bring up the mainframe thing, but there's still companies running mid-ranges. There's still companies, like, people are always like, well, Richard, you're anti-cloud. I'm like, really? I'm anti-cloud. Do fax machines still exist? And then people pause, and I'm like, why do fax machines still exist? Because they're the tool that fits the purpose, right? And the only problem that we really haven't been able to conquer is that a lot of those assets that are going to continue to stay in that category, in the hybrid category, for till you and I are dead, right? It's really, really difficult to get the valuable information, transactional data, and those kind of things out of them and use them in other applications or business solutions, right? So, you've got this kind of opportunity to really amp up the capabilities for consumers and citizens and everything by being able to tap into all of these kind of cordoned off resources. The downside to that is that really, do we need marketers to have 100 times more information than they currently have today? They haven't proven themselves to be really trustworthy with what they've had, right? Do we really need? I mean, we already know the argument, which is, if you have a data protection or a data privacy issue, it's probably because you already have too much data, right? And data that you don't even need, or data that you don't even have a purpose for, but you need to hold on to it because one day you might. Right now, you open up the gates with the API side of the equation and add even more data or more enriched information to customer profiles and all those kind of things. We can clearly see where the bad guys are going. And it's interesting. I just did a magazine interview yesterday, and we started talking about the evolution of Emotet, right? This malware, that's been around for quite a while, right? And Emotet's moved to 60. Sorry to nerd out, guys. Tech, I'm not diving deep. I'm just saying, here's what the bad guys are doing. Emotet has moved to 64-bit. It's moved to elliptical curve encryption, meaning it's going to be, incredibly difficult for enterprise organizations to actually crack the encryption of what's going on in the payloads that are being delivered. And when you look at what they're doing, a number of companies have done analysis on, did 64-bit amp up the capabilities for Emotet? And when you look at it, it hasn't. They're not doing anything with it. But what are they doing? They're actually disclosing their product strategy. They are building a malware that is multi-platform and hybrid capable. Why are they doing that? Because they know that things like API are blowing up the possibility of massive amounts of increased data. They also know that APIs are both internal and external. So they need to be able to create a tool set that allows them to capitalize on one company's entire IT infrastructure, application layer, and OS frontier. And that's exactly what they're doing. So this gets back to, I'll put the nail on the series of comments here with when you see the bad actors making things important, APIs, identity, you really shouldn't be spending time in your company debating about whether things like identity and API security are important, because the bad actors have already decided it is. You're already behind, and you're wasting time if you're sitting there debating about it, right? The release of value with APIs is going to be enormous. The consequent damages for irresponsible behaviors on our parts around that data and attacks by bad actors are going to be substantial, unless we're really thinking about API security.
Yeah, I like how you laid out the example from the malicious actors' perspective and how they are looking to be more diverse in terms of systems that they can touch and compromise and take advantage of. It's kind of like a product, from the product side, right? They want to have a diverse product can be used by a lot of people. They want to have a diverse, malicious capability that can be leveraged in a lot of different ways.
Yep.
So I wanted to ask, for folks that aren't too familiar with API security, whether individually as a practitioner or professional or organizationally, you're starting to think about, API security. Where do they start? Where are some of the things to take a look at first? Where do you even begin on the topic?
Yeah, I think that there's certainly a lot of good, basic research that you can do. We all do Dr. Google, right? But I think two books that kind of stand out as two sides of the same equation. I believe that if you're in cybersecurity and you love what you do, you're probably half a criminal. right? And that's just, you have to, and by that I mean we're not going out and you know breaking into people's crypto wallets. What I mean is that you got to be able to think like a bad actor, right? And that's fun to do, right? And that's why I think it's really important as a practitioner that you get both sides of an equation. So there's two books, APIs in Action, and then Hacking APIs. Actually, Corey Bell's book just came out just recently, a couple months ago. It really proud of the fact that Enon Shketi and Tyler Reynolds, who are at Traceable, are actually mentioned in Corey's book. They were part of his resource and research basis to write that book. I think you need to understand the behaviors and the constructs of APIs, and how they're put together. But I think it's also important for you to understand how they're exploited. I think within those two books, you've got a good, 3-4 weeks of solid reading, and it gives you a good basis and understanding on how the mechanics of each side of that equation work. After that, I think you're really, probably in a space where you want to start getting your hands dirty a little bit, right? And I'm not a particularly good, in the weeds technologist, but I can write an API, right? So that's the beauty of them too, is that they're actually relatively simple to put together. The downside is they're also relatively simple to screw up, which I'm really good at. But those would be the two places that I kind of begin your learning and development on API security, if you wanted to dive into the subject.
Awesome. Yeah, I just dropped a link in the chat for folks. It's APIs in Action, and then also Hacking APIs. So definitely check those two books out. I've started diving into the second one a little bit myself already, so it's a good read so far. So I'd want to ask, one of the last questions I want to ask you, being a veteran myself, and, we see a lot of military veterans transition into cybersecurity. Obviously, maybe there's a lot of, military mindset that comes with, cybersecurity, the way you think about things, for example. What lessons do you think your military experience, have helped you on the cybersecurity front?
No, I'd go back to, characteristics of human behavior, right? When you are in the military, and it's not universal, right? I'm not talking bad about people in the Air Force, because I was a United States Army Airborne paratrooper, but you are intimately familiar with threat, right? I actually, people might question that statement, but look, like, who do we ascribe to be, the best in cybersecurity? The Israelis, right? There's a culture that has struggled, in its living with threat, for a very, very long time. I think that dynamic is consistent throughout kind of military service, regardless of what country it's in, right? You become familiar with threat. Threat motivates you to understand personal security and risk, right? Great example is that, I don't know about you, but if you're jumping out of airplanes for a living with a 50 caliber machine gun bolt strapped to your hip, even though you have a parachute rigger, you're still checking your kit, right? You're still making sure that you're going out the door with everything that you need to actually land safely. And I think that perspective of understanding threat is a world where military resources live. And it makes those resources naturals in terms of, it makes them the A-rods getting thrown off the dock in the lake, right? Once they get into a corporate or a private enterprise setting. I think, the challenge is that, as right, when you're in the military, it comes with a substantial amount of rigor and discipline. It comes with a substantial amount of guidance. You really don't get to freestyle unless you're in some very, very specific units. And it takes some time in that transition period for people to get out of that kind of directive driven life, and really kind of open up their capabilities. and I'm going to be frank, I've worked with a lot of military veterans in cybersecurity trades. If there was one thing that was kind of a defining characteristic of what makes you successful or not successful as a joining veteran into the cybersecurity profession, it is your ability to get past that directive-driven life and get into kind of the actual opportunistic drive-by ad hoc realities of what the public sector looks like. And folks that are able to make that transition are usually very, very successful in cybersecurity. Those that aren't, they just find that it typically isn't the career path that works for them, which is great. I'm all about veterans taking, a very odd, it's like Liam Neeson, a very odd set of skills gathered over a very long career. I'm trying to figure out how they apply in the public sector, because I'm going to tell you what, shooting a 50 caliber machine gun and a Star Wars turret on a Humvee doesn't really have a public sector translation, other than cool stories when I'm out drinking with my friends, right? Yeah, I think it's really important for people to find where the tangible skills that they had in the military translate into the intangible needs in the market, and figuring out how to make those types of connections and transitions.
Yeah, that was a really awesome way to put it, in terms of, taking the benefits from the structure and rigor and discipline of the military, but learning to be more, creative and dynamic and flexible in the commercial space. So I like that a lot. The last question I wanted to ask you, that we ask everyone, is, what does the term cyber resiliency mean to you? We ask everyone because it has, everyone has a different interpretation or understanding of what that may be.
Well, for me, cyber resiliency, it really means making sure that you have a capability to recover that is equally dimensioned to your capability to defend. Right. The problem that I see is, so I've had the term, the fatalism that I hate, and people hear me say this all the time. I hate it when anybody in the information security industry says it's not a matter of if, it's a matter of when. Right? That fatalism, there is nothing else in human endeavor where we wake up in the morning and go, I know I'm going to get my ass kicked. Right? And if it is, if we have that, we don't get up the next morning and go, and I'm going to let it happen again. Right? I'm not saying that it's warfare. I'm not saying it's a game. I'm not saying it's not. Right? What I'm saying is that if our wake up attitude is it's a matter of if, it's not a matter of if, it's a matter of when, isn't again supported by data and evidence. Why? Why do I say that? And why do I say that in the context of cyber resilience? It's because if it was a matter of when, we would have seen over the last 20 years substantial amounts of money, funding, resources, process, people poured into resiliency, poured into IR and disaster recovery, pulled into, and you know what? It hasn't been, right? We didn't go, okay, we're going to get hit, so we're going to prove all of our capabilities to recover. We all sat around and twiddled our thumbs and said, oh, poor us, we're going to get hit. And then what? So, for me, it's about equal dimensions. If your defense is really good, your resilience should be really good. If your defense is really blah, your resilience better be freaking awesome. Right? Because in order to reach that equilibrium of balance, if you really stink at the basic security, you're going to have to be 10 times better on the resiliency side of the equation. Right? It's just simple math, right? And it's the economics of the exploit culture. Like, resilience to me is being able to recover as well as you are being able to defend. And I don't know that everyone would ever agree with me on that representation, but I've been on the bad end of the stick. I've had simple things that have cost me, significant amounts because my resiliency capabilities just simply were not on equal footing with my defense capabilities.
Yeah, something you said there, and I don't know if you're familiar with this individual or this book, I should say. Like, there's an individual, another notable CISO in the community named Sunil Yu. And he has something called the Cyber Defense Matrix. And he went and took a look at the market at products, right? And it, identify, protect, detect, respond, recover, so on. And disproportionately, everything was on the identify, protect, detect. and
Yep.
not much investment on recovery. So you really kind of pointed that out with your statement there. So I like that answer a lot.
Yep.
Yeah, definitely. So Richard, thanks so much for being here. I think a lot of folks enjoyed the conversation, and I know I certainly did, and look forward to following your journey at Traceable as well.
I appreciate that. Thanks so much, Chris. It's been a blast. I enjoy conversations like this where I just kind of get to, freestyle. If I offended anybody, just reach out and connect with me on LinkedIn. We'll become friends.
Definitely. Sounds good. All right, everyone, have a good weekend.
All right. Later.